Bark, bark, woof, woof. I'm Darwin, and yes, I'm named after Charles Darwin. You know, the one who wrote about evolution and natural selection. Anyway, today we're here to learn about species. Have you ever wondered what the definition of a species is? In the scientific community, a species is a way to classify similar organisms. This becomes important when trying to protect organisms or determining biodiversity. Here's a visualization. Pretend these shapes are different creatures. The way we group them together based on similarities may be considered a species. Seems easy, right? Well, it turns out it's not quite so simple. There are so many ways to group organisms that there isn't a straight answer. Are you lost? I used to be too. This stuff is kind of rough. There are many different species concepts that each have their own definition for what a species is. There are over 27 different species concepts, but today we will only be going over 3 different species concepts to keep things from getting too confusing. The 3 species concepts we will be covering are the biological species concept, the morphological species concept, and the ecological species concept. Personally, I'm a visual learner, so I want to take you through these concepts through one of my favorite animals, dinosaurs. We can take my time machine to the age of dinosaurs. First, let's begin with the biological species concept. It describes species as a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. 2 important ideas to note within this concept is reproductive isolation and that species cannot produce viable, fertile offspring with other species. Now you may be wondering, what does viable, fertile offspring mean? Viable means the offspring have the capability to survive the age of reproduction. Fertile means capable of producing babies or offspring. For example, this baby dino here will get to grow up and have children of its own. If it wasn't viable, then it would, die. Reproductive isolation is essentially biological barriers which prevent 2 members of a species from breeding with each other and producing offspring. With the presence of barriers, there's a blockage of gene flow. Gene flow is the movement of genes into or out of populations. For example, if there are no barriers, the dinosaurs can reproduce and have offspring. In this case, they're considered a species. However, if there's a rushing river between 2 populations of dinosaurs, there's a lack of gene flow because they are unable to transfer genes between the 2 populations. Over time, these dinosaurs may grow more and more different as they face different challenges. Eventually, they may no longer be able to have children, and they may be considered different species. Just a side note, barriers are not always visible. They can be genetic too. But unfortunately, there are always exceptions. Oops, sorry. For example, one limitation is hybrids. 2 different species can have a baby. This baby is therefore known as a hybrid. Some examples you may be familiar with are ligers. In these scenarios, 2 different species can form viable, fertile offspring, which breaks the biological species concept. You may be wondering, if the biological species concept is flawed, what other concepts can we look at? Luckily, there are plenty of options. Other species concepts, such as the morphological species concept, can also help to decide what organisms can be classified as a species. The morphological species concept allows scientists to discern species based on appearance. This concept compares different physical characteristics in order to group them together. Take a look at these dinosaurs. It's very easy to guess that they are the same species because they look the same. They have the same shape and size, which lets scientists classify them together. This is convenient because humans really like grouping things based on appearance. This species concept has been used for hundreds of years, way before anyone knew anything about genes.
Hey Darwin, my name is George. I want to introduce you to my mate Sally. While we don't look alike, we're the same species and mate.
I was wondering how the morphological species concept would classify us. Based on appearances, we'd probably be classified as separate species.
Scientists have trouble telling what organisms are really the same species or just similar. They often argue over what features are the most important for classification, which can affect what organisms are in a species, and, in the case of me and Sally, some species can look wildly different based on gender, location, and climate.
I guess I never thought about that before. That does make things difficult, doesn't it? Perhaps we should look at another species concept to get a better idea of what a species can be. Now last but certainly not least, we have the ecological species concept. This concept says that you can define different species by the roles they play in their environment and the way they interact with different biotic and abiotic factors. Now you may be wondering what exactly a biotic or abiotic factor is. Essentially, biotic factors are the interactions between species. This could be through things such as predation, herbivory, or even just the presence or absence of food. Abiotic factors are things that aren't caused by or affected by other living things such as weather, temperature, or sunlight. So with that in mind, we can better distinguish different species. For example, let me introduce you to Petunia. She loves eating fish and all kinds of small animals. Some of the ways she interacts with and affects the environment she lives in revolve around this aspect. For example, she has hooked claws and sharp teeth that help her catch and eat fish. So even if there are plants and larger animals around, she sticks to the rivers. That's her niche. On the other hand, though, this fella here, Fred the Fern, doesn't like meat or any other kind of food we are used to. He is a big fan of making his own food, and he does this using sunlight and photosynthesis. However, Fred always has to be on the lookout because he provides nutrients and energy to other species. I'm sure you can tell that there is a big enough difference between my two friends and the ways they interact with their environment and those around them that warrant some sort of differentiation. This is exactly how scientists employ the ecological species concept. They look at all these different organisms and observe how they interact with each other and their surroundings. And if they are similar enough, they are classified as one species. However, there are still downsides to this way of classification because it requires a really thorough understanding of the roles different organisms play in their environment, which can be really hard to observe. It also doesn't take into account that some organisms are different, but still similar enough to have gene flow. And there you have it. We've gone through some of the major species concepts. The biological, morphological, and ecological species concepts are all useful for the identification of species, but they all have their problems. Despite this, they're all important to classifying species and for efforts like preservation, that is, keeping a species protected. That's all I have for you on the species concepts today. Now, let's head back to our own time. Farewell, friends. Till next time.